The black maid stayed beside the sick child all night, and the Mafia boss didn't know how to repay such devotion. Jasmine had always been the quiet type, staying in the background, doing her job without ever drawing attention to herself. But tonight was different. Benji, the young boy she had been caring for in the Castellano household for months, was sick. He had been running a high fever for hours, his small body trembling as he lay in the bed, his forehead slick with sweat. Jasmine could hear his weak, labored breathing, each one a desperate gasp for relief. His mother, the formidable Mrs. Castellano, had long since retreated to her own quarters, leaving Jasmine to handle the situation alone. She couldn't blame her. The family had never been the most hands-on when it came to Benji's well-being, and tonight was no exception. Jasmine sat by his side, wiping his face with a damp cloth, her heart aching as she whispered soft words of comfort. "You're going to be okay, Benji. Just hold on for me." The room felt cold, despite the warmth of the night air seeping through the window. Jasmine adjusted the blankets around Benji, trying to make him more comfortable, though she knew there was little she could do. Her thoughts wandered to Dominic Castellano, the man she had worked for, the Mafia boss who had a reputation for being ruthless and cold-hearted. She had never seen him show an ounce of compassion, at least not toward her. He treated her as little more than a servant, someone who existed only to take care of his home and his son. But tonight, as she watched Benji struggle, she couldn't help but wonder if there was a softer side to Dominic, one that she had never seen. The clock on the wall ticked loudly in the silence of the room, each passing second stretching on forever. Jasmine had long since given up on sleep. Her only focus now was keeping Benji comfortable. She knew she couldn't leave him, not when he was so fragile, so vulnerable. And as the hours dragged on, she felt herself growing more exhausted, her own body aching from sitting in one place for too long. But still she stayed. Jasmine didn't even hear the soft creak of the door as it opened, nor did she notice the figure standing in the doorway, until she felt a presence beside her. She looked up, startled to find Dominic Castellano standing there, his sharp eyes fixed on Benji. He was still dressed in his suit, his posture as imposing as ever, but his expression was different. There was no anger, no icy detachment. For the first time, she saw something else, a hint of concern, something she could barely recognize. He stepped forward slowly, his gaze never leaving Benji. Jasmine stayed silent, unsure of what to say or do. She had never imagined that the Mafia boss, the man who ruled over a vast criminal empire, could care about something as fragile as a sick child. But here he was, standing in front of her, his eyes softening as he watched his son. "How long has he been like this?" Dominic's voice was low, almost gentle. Jasmine hesitated, but then answered softly, "A few hours now. I've been trying to cool him down, but it's not getting better." Dominic nodded, his gaze still fixed on Benji. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Jasmine couldn't bring herself to look directly at him. What was there to say? She was just the maid, the woman who cleaned his house and took care of his son, nothing more. But then, to her surprise, Dominic reached over and placed a hand on her shoulder. The touch was brief, but it sent a ripple of warmth through her. "You've done more than I could," he said, his voice rough. Jasmine looked up at him, caught off guard by his words. She had never expected him to acknowledge her efforts, let alone thank her. She didn't know how to respond, but she nodded slightly, her throat tightening with emotion. Dominic stepped back, his gaze flicking to the door. "I'll have the doctor here as soon as possible," he said, his tone steady, but there was something softer in it now. He paused, his eyes meeting hers again. "Thank you, Jasmine. You're doing more for him than anyone else ever would." With that, he turned and left the room, leaving Jasmine standing there, stunned by his unexpected kindness. She sat there for a moment, unable to fully process what had just happened. Was it real? Had the Mafia boss really shown her, of all people, some measure of gratitude? Jasmine's heart was still racing as she returned her attention to Benji, her eyes welling up with tears. For the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to hope. Jasmine sat by the bed, her eyes fixed on Benji as he slept fitfully. The fever still hadn't broken, but at least his breathing was steadier. She wiped his forehead with a damp cloth, a quiet gesture that seemed so small, yet it was the only comfort she could offer in this moment. The mansion around them felt like an empty shell, the silence of the night pressing in on her as she stayed vigilant. It had been hours since Dominic had left, and though he had promised to send the doctor, Jasmine couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. She had never imagined that Dominic would care about his son's well-being in such a personal way. He was always the cold, calculating Mafia boss, not the kind of man to linger by his child's bedside. Yet here she was, sitting in the very room where he had stood not long ago, her mind racing with the unexpected kindness he had shown. She couldn't understand it. Was he really concerned about Benji, or had something else shifted in him? The power dynamic between them had always been clear. He was the one who gave orders, and she was the one who followed them. She had never been more than a servant in his eyes, but tonight things felt different. Jasmine couldn't help but replay the brief moment when he had placed his hand on her shoulder. It had been brief, but it felt like a lifetime. His touch was firm but not demanding. Something about it felt protective. She shook her head, trying to clear the confusing thoughts swirling in her mind. She needed to focus on Benji. The boy needed her, and she wasn't going to leave him now, not when he was this vulnerable. The hours dragged on, each minute heavier than the last. Jasmine's eyes grew heavier with fatigue, but she refused to let herself sleep. She knew that if she closed her eyes, even for a moment, she might miss something. Benji's condition could change at any moment. She continued to sit by his side, her heart aching at how small and fragile he looked. He had always been a sweet boy, full of life, but tonight, he seemed so far away. The sound of his weak breathing was the only thing that kept her tethered to reality. As the clock on the wall ticked on, Jasmine tried to push her thoughts of Dominic away, but they lingered, haunting her. She had known him for months now, and she had seen firsthand how ruthless he could be. His presence was enough to make anyone feel small, but tonight she had seen a different side of him. The thought made her feel conflicted. Was he truly a good man? Or was it just a rare moment of vulnerability? The door creaked open, pulling Jasmine from her thoughts. She didn't need to turn around to know who it was. Dominic stepped into the room, his imposing figure filling the doorway. His eyes immediately went to Benji, his face unreadable as he took in the sight of his son still in the grip of fever. Jasmine stood up quickly, unsure of what to say. Her mind raced, but her tongue felt heavy. Dominic didn't say anything at first. He simply walked over to the bedside, his gaze never leaving Benji. The silence between them was thick, almost suffocating. How is he? Dominic's voice was low, quieter than she had ever heard it. Jasmine opened her mouth to speak, but found herself at a loss for words. He's still sick, she managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. Dominic nodded, his jaw tightening as he reached down to feel Benji's forehead. Jasmine held her breath, watching him. His expression didn't change, but there was a certain softness to it now, something she hadn't seen before. He looked at Benji for a long moment before turning back to her. I'm sorry, he said, his voice almost a whisper. You've been here all night, haven't you? Jasmine nodded, unsure of how to respond. She hadn't expected him to acknowledge the hours she had spent by Benji's side. The Mafia boss, the man who controlled everything in his empire, was apologizing to her, the maid, for her dedication. It felt surreal. Thank you, Dominic said, his eyes meeting hers. There was something in his gaze, a flicker of something genuine. I don't know how to repay you for this. Jasmine's heart skipped a beat at his words. She hadn't expected him to say anything like that, not after the way he had treated her in the past. She wasn't sure what to say in return, so she simply smiled, though it felt awkward, out of place. I'm just doing my job, she replied, her voice soft. Dominic didn't seem to buy it. He shook his head, a small smile playing at the corner of his lips. No, he said. This is beyond what anyone could expect. You've done more than I could ever ask for. The weight of his words hung in the air between them, and for a moment, Jasmine didn't know how to react. She had never imagined hearing such words from him. Dominic was a man of few words, and most of them were harsh. But tonight, something had shifted. He turned away from Benji, his eyes still on Jasmine. I'll make sure the doctor gets here as soon as possible, he said. Jasmine nodded, feeling a strange warmth spread through her chest. She had never expected this, never imagined that the Mafia boss, the man who held so much power, would show such care. But as she looked at him now, standing in the quiet room with her, she realized that maybe, just maybe, there was more to him than she had thought. The doctor arrived early the next morning, just as the first light of dawn filtered through the thick curtains of Benji's room. Dominic had insisted on the best for his son, and the private physician was no exception. He moved swiftly and efficiently, examining Benji with a practiced eye. Jasmine stood off to the side, watching him work, her mind still reeling from the events of the previous night. Dominic had left shortly after his words of gratitude, promising to return with more help if needed. His sudden kindness had caught her completely off guard, and she found herself unable to shake the image of his concerned gaze as he had looked at Benji. It was a side of him she had never seen before. She had worked for the Castellano family for almost 2 years, and in that time, she had never once seen Dominic act with such tenderness. His reputation was built on strength and fear, and yet, in the quiet of Benji's room, she had seen a flicker of something more. She didn't know what to make of it. Was it real? Or had it simply been an isolated moment? The doctor finished his examination and turned to Dominic, who had returned just as the sun fully rose. His eyes were focused, calculating, but there was a subtle shift in his demeanor when he looked at Benji, now lying still on the bed. The fever should break soon, the doctor said, his voice calm and authoritative. It was likely just a viral infection. I'll leave some medication to ease the symptoms. Dominic nodded, his expression unreadable as he absorbed the information. He glanced over at Jasmine, who had been standing quietly by the window. Her heart raced as he turned his gaze toward her. Thank you, he said, his voice low but sincere. Jasmine felt a strange warmth spread through her chest at his words. She nodded, her throat tight, unsure of what to say. It was as if everything had shifted overnight. She had never imagined Dominic, the man who had always treated her as a mere employee, would show such appreciation for her efforts. I'll stay here with him, Dominic continued, his voice firm as he approached Benji's side. You should rest, he added, glancing at Jasmine. You've been up all night. Jasmine blinked, still processing his earlier words. She had expected him to send her away, as he usually did. But instead, he was offering her rest, offering her something more than what she had ever expected. She didn't know how to respond. But Dominic didn't wait for an answer. He gently sat at the edge of Benji's bed, his hand resting lightly on his son's arm as he looked down at the boy. For a long moment, there was only silence. Jasmine felt herself slipping into the background once more, just as she always had. She was used to being invisible, to being the quiet one who took care of the house, while the world around her moved on. But this time, things were different. For some reason, Dominic's presence in the room didn't feel as intimidating as it usually did. There was a gentleness to his touch, a softness in the way he looked at his son. Jasmine lingered by the door, unsure of her place. She had never felt more like an outsider than in this moment, yet she also felt an undeniable pull to stay, to witness the side of Dominic that she had never seen before. It was as if the walls around him were beginning to crack, just slightly, and she was caught in the process of watching him change. The minutes passed slowly, but Jasmine didn't want to leave. She had no reason to stay, no obligation to be there, but something about the moment held her in place. She couldn't quite put her finger on it, but there was a feeling in the air, a tension that was both unfamiliar and comforting at the same time. Dominic finally broke the silence. You should go and get some sleep, he said again, his voice softer now. Jasmine hesitated, her mind racing. She didn't want to leave Benji's side, but she also knew that Dominic had already taken charge of the situation. She nodded silently and turned toward the door, ready to leave, but as she reached for the handle, she heard him call her name. Jasmine, Dominic said, his voice quiet but firm. She turned back to face him, her heart pounding. He was looking at her with an intensity she had never seen before. His eyes were no longer cold and calculating. They were warm, sincere, and full of something she couldn't quite understand. Thank you, he repeated, his voice low and genuine. I don't know what I would have done without you. Jasmine swallowed, her breath catching in her throat. She wasn't used to receiving gratitude from him, let alone so much of it. She had always been the one who gave, the one who served, but never the one who was recognized for her efforts. And yet here he was, thanking her, acknowledging her in a way that made her heart race. It's nothing, she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. I'm just doing my job. But even as she said the words, she knew they weren't true. What she had done for Benji went beyond her duties as a maid. She had stayed up all night, had been there for him when no one else was. And somehow, in that moment, she realized that it wasn't just about the job. It was about something much deeper. Something that had begun to shift between her and Dominic. Something that she couldn't quite understand, but that felt real. She glanced at him one last time before she left the room, and for the first time since she had come to work for the Castellano family, she didn't feel invisible. She felt seen. The next few days were a blur for Jasmine. She spent her time caring for Benji, watching over him as the fever slowly receded. Dominic was always there, lurking in the background, checking in on his son, his presence oddly comforting. Jasmine couldn't help but notice the change in him. He was still the same dominant, stoic figure, but there was something different in the way he interacted with Benji. He wasn't just the Mafia boss anymore. He was a father, a man who had lost touch with his softer side but was desperately trying to reconnect. It was a strange dynamic, one Jasmine hadn't expected, but it felt real. The mansion had an oppressive air to it, as if every room held secrets. But in the quiet moments when she was alone with Dominic and Benji, Jasmine felt a sense of peace that she hadn't known in years. It was as though the walls of the Castellano family, the ones that had always felt so insurmountable, were beginning to crack, just a little. One evening, as Jasmine was sitting by Benji's side, reading quietly to him as he rested, Dominic walked in with a tray of food. He placed it on the small table beside Benji's bed, his gaze flicking to Jasmine before he spoke. "You've been doing more than I could ever ask," he said, his voice low but steady. Jasmine looked up at him, unsure of how to respond. His words caught her off guard, as they always did. The Mafia boss was acknowledging her once again, but this time, it wasn't just a passing comment. There was sincerity in his voice, a depth to his words that made her heart race. "I'm just doing my job," she replied softly, but even she could hear the uncertainty in her own voice. Dominic didn't seem to mind her answer. Instead, he sat down beside the bed, his attention turning to Benji. He reached out, brushing a lock of hair from the boy's forehead, his expression softening. "You're doing more than that," Dominic said quietly. "You're giving him something I haven't been able to give him for a long time." Jasmine's heart skipped a beat at his words. She wasn't sure if he was talking about Benji or about himself. She glanced at him, trying to read his expression, but it was impossible. Dominic had always been so guarded, so distant. Yet in moments like this, when he wasn't in control, when he wasn't the powerful man that everyone feared, Jasmine saw something else. She saw a man who was just as vulnerable as anyone else, a man who had loved and lost, and was now doing his best to fix the broken pieces of his life. The weight of his gaze felt heavy, but not in the usual oppressive way. This time, it was different. It felt like an invitation, a subtle acknowledgement that there was something more between them than just employer and employee. Jasmine couldn't explain it, but she felt a strange pull toward him, something she had never felt before. "You don't have to stay, Jasmine," Dominic said, breaking the silence. His voice was gentle, almost hesitant, a stark contrast to his usual commanding tone. "You've been here all night. Get some rest." Jasmine opened her mouth to protest, but she stopped herself. There was something about Dominic's words, the way he spoke to her, that made her rethink everything. She had always been the one to keep pushing herself, to keep giving and giving until there was nothing left. But Dominic was offering her something else. Rest. Peace. She hesitated for a moment, torn between her responsibility to Benji and her own exhaustion. But as she looked at Dominic, sitting beside his son with such tenderness, she realized that Benji was in good hands. She didn't need to be there every second. "Okay," she finally said, her voice soft. "I'll rest for a little while." Dominic gave her a small nod, his eyes lingering on hers for a moment longer than necessary. Jasmine couldn't read his expression, but she knew something had shifted between them. Something unspoken, something that felt like the beginning of a new chapter. She turned and left the room, her mind racing with thoughts of the past few days. She had never imagined that working for the Castellano family would lead to anything like this. She had always kept her distance, always been careful not to get too involved. But now, things were different. The walls that had once kept her at arm's length from the rest of the world, from Dominic, were slowly coming down. And for the first time, Jasmine wondered if she might finally find her place in this strange, complicated world. As she lay down in her small room, the Sound of Benji's steady breathing still fresh in her mind. Jasmine couldn't help but wonder where this path would lead. Was this just a fleeting moment of kindness from Dominic, or was there something more? She didn't know. But as she closed her eyes, she realized that for the first time in a long while, she was willing to find out. The following days seemed to pass in a blur for Jasmine. She continued to care for Benji, watching him as his health gradually improved. The fever had broken, and though he still looked pale and weak, there was a light in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Jasmine couldn't help but feel a sense of relief. She had been by his side through it all, and it was comforting to see him getting better, even if it was only a small improvement. Dominic had continued to check in on Benji every day, always asking about his condition, always ensuring that he had everything he needed. But it wasn't just about Benji anymore. It was about the way Dominic's presence had started to shift. The cold, distant man who had once ruled his household with an iron fist was now showing signs of vulnerability. The soft glances he gave Benji, the quiet concern in his voice when he asked how the boy was doing. Jasmine couldn't help but notice these small moments. There was a tenderness in him now that she had never seen before. It wasn't the hardened Mafia boss she had come to know. It was something much softer, something that made her question everything she thought she knew about him. But Jasmine knew better than to allow herself to get too caught up in these thoughts. She had learned long ago to keep her distance from people like Dominic Castellano. They were powerful, unpredictable, and ultimately out of her reach. She was just a maid, a servant in his world, and she didn't belong to the same sphere as him. Her duty was clear: care for Benji, do her job, and keep her emotions in check. That was all. Still, as the days went on, Jasmine found herself drawn to Dominic in a way she hadn't expected. It wasn't just the way he treated Benji, it was the way he had started to treat her. There were moments when their eyes would meet across a room, and for a brief second, it felt like there was something unspoken between them. A shared understanding, a recognition that went beyond the roles they played in each other's lives. But Jasmine quickly dismissed these thoughts. She couldn't afford to entertain them. She had a job to do, and getting too involved with Dominic would only lead to heartache. The evening air had grown cool as autumn settled in, and Jasmine was once again seated beside Benji's bed, watching him sleep. The night had fallen quietly, and the house was eerily still. She had just finished reading him a story, her voice soft and comforting as she watched him drift into a peaceful sleep. She stood up, preparing to leave the room for a moment to take a break, when she heard the door creak open. She turned, surprised to see Dominic standing there, his figure framed in the doorway. "How is he?" he asked quietly, his voice low. Jasmine smiled softly, nodding. "He's doing better," she replied, her voice filled with relief. Dominic stepped into the room, his presence filling the space. He looked down at Benji, his expression softening as he watched his son sleep. There was a long silence between them, neither of them speaking, as they both stood there, observing the boy. Finally, Dominic spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you," he said. "I don't know how to thank you for what you've done." Jasmine turned to him, her heart fluttering at the sincerity in his voice. She wasn't used to hearing him speak like this, especially not to her. It was as if the walls between them were beginning to come down, one small crack at a time. "It's nothing," she said quickly, lowering her gaze. "I'm just doing my job." Dominic shook his head. "No," he said firmly. "You've done more than anyone could have asked. You've been here for him when no one else was. I can't repay that." Jasmine didn't know how to respond. She had always been the one to give, never the one to receive. And here was Dominic, the man she had once seen as untouchable, acknowledging her efforts, making her feel seen in a way she had never felt before. The silence stretched on, but it was a comfortable silence, filled with something that neither of them had expected. Dominic was still standing by Benji's side, his eyes on the boy, but there was a change in his demeanor, a softness that hadn't been there before. Jasmine took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. She had never imagined that the Mafia boss, the man who controlled everything around him, could ever be so human. And yet, here he was, showing her a side of him that she could hardly comprehend. She wanted to say something, but the words caught in her throat. What could she say to him? How could she explain the emotions that were beginning to stir in her chest? "I'll stay here with him tonight," Dominic said, breaking the silence. "You should get some rest. You've done more than enough." Jasmine hesitated, looking at Benji, then back at Dominic. She wanted to stay, to keep watch over Benji, but she was also exhausted, both physically and emotionally. For the first time in a long time, she realized that she didn't have to do it all on her own. Dominic was offering her something she hadn't expected: rest, a break. She nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you," she said. As she stepped out of the room, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. The man she had always known as cold and unfeeling was slowly becoming someone she could trust. Someone who, despite his power, was showing her kindness in ways that she never thought possible. And as she walked down the hallway, the weight of the day finally catching up with her, she allowed herself to close her eyes for the first time in what felt like forever. The next few days felt like a turning point for both Jasmine and Dominic. Jasmine had never allowed herself to relax completely, especially when it came to her work. But after that night, after Dominic had encouraged her to rest, something had shifted. She found herself feeling lighter, not just physically, but emotionally. She had always kept her guard up, especially around Dominic. But his recent gestures, his kindness toward Benji, and his quiet appreciation for her work had made her begin to see him differently. Dominic, too, had begun to change. Jasmine could see it in the way he interacted with his son, in the way he took more time to be present, not just as a father, but as a man trying to do right by his family. He still had his moments of being the distant, authoritative figure, but they were fewer now. The way he would check in on Benji, asking how he was feeling, the way he took small moments to offer a reassuring word to Jasmine. These were things she never expected from him. One afternoon, as Jasmine was walking through the hallway to the kitchen, she overheard a conversation coming from the study. It was Dominic's voice, but it wasn't the usual commanding tone she was used to. His voice was softer, almost vulnerable. Curiosity got the better of her, and she stopped by the door, careful not to make a sound. "I don't know what I'm doing anymore," Dominic's voice said, a hint of frustration seeping through. Jasmine's heart skipped a beat. She had never heard him speak like this. "Everything I've built, it's been about control, about power. But Benji, he's different. I can't control everything when it comes to him." Jasmine could hear the heaviness in his voice, and it made her feel something deep in her chest. She had always known Dominic as the man who controlled everything with a sharp, calculating mind. To hear him admit that there was something he couldn't control, something that made him question everything, was startling. She had always thought of him as invincible, untouchable. But now, she was beginning to see cracks in that armor. She didn't want to eavesdrop, but she couldn't bring herself to move. There was something about hearing him like this, so open, so raw, that made her feel connected to him in a way she hadn't before. "It's not your fault," a woman's voice responded. Jasmine recognized it as Mrs. Castellanos. "You can't control everything. Not everything can be fixed by force." "I know," Dominic replied, his voice almost a whisper. "But I don't know how to do this. I'm not used to being vulnerable." Jasmine felt a pang of sympathy for him. It was strange, hearing Dominic speak so openly about his struggles. She had never thought of him as someone who needed help, as someone who could be vulnerable. But hearing him now, she realized that even the most powerful people had their own battles, their own fears. She hadn't meant to overhear this conversation, but it left her with a feeling she couldn't shake. She had always seen Dominic as a distant, almost intimidating figure. But now she saw him in a new light. He was a father, a man who loved his son, and was trying to find his way in a world where power and control weren't the answers to everything. She quietly stepped away from the door, not wanting to intrude further. As she made her way down the hallway, her mind was racing. She had never imagined that Dominic Castellano could be so human, and she had never expected to feel so connected to him, even if it was in a way she couldn't fully understand. The next few days were filled with small moments. Dominic began to open up more, not just to Jasmine, but to everyone in the house. His interactions with Benji became more affectionate, and there was a gentleness in his eyes when he looked at his son. Jasmine couldn't help but notice the change in him. He wasn't just the Mafia boss anymore. He was a father who wanted the best for his son, someone who was learning, just like everyone else, how to balance power with love. One evening, after dinner, Dominic found Jasmine sitting alone in the kitchen, sipping a cup of tea. The house was quiet, and for once, it felt like everything was still. He stood in the doorway for a moment, watching her, before he stepped inside. "Can I join you?" he asked softly. Jasmine looked up, a little startled, but nodded. "Of course," she replied, her voice soft. Dominic sat down across from her, his expression unreadable. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. It wasn't uncomfortable, but there was a tension between them, an unspoken connection that neither knew how to address. Finally, Dominic broke the silence. "I wanted to thank you," he said quietly, "for everything you've done. For Benji. For me." Jasmine felt her heart race at his words. It wasn't the usual cold gratitude he offered, the kind he gave when he was just going through the motions. This time, it was genuine, sincere. "I'm just doing my job," she said, a little embarrassed by the attention. Dominic shook his head. "It's more than that," he said softly. "You've been there for him when I couldn't. You've shown him more kindness than I ever could. And for that, I'm grateful." Jasmine felt a lump form in her throat. She had never expected to hear those words from him. It was as if, in this moment, all the walls between them had finally come down. She didn't know how to respond, so she simply smiled. Dominic's gaze lingered on her for a moment longer, and for the first time, Jasmine felt as though they were truly on equal ground. There was no hierarchy, no employer and employee. Just two people, connecting in a way they had never done before. As Dominic stood to leave, he turned back to her. "If you ever need anything, Jasmine," he said quietly, "don't hesitate to ask." With that, he left the room, leaving Jasmine sitting there, her heart full of emotions she couldn't quite explain. She didn't know what the future held, or where this newfound connection would take them, but for the first time, she felt a glimmer of hope that things were changing. And maybe, just maybe, she wasn't invisible anymore. The days after Dominic's quiet acknowledgement of Jasmine's efforts seemed to change the atmosphere of the Castellano mansion. There was an unspoken understanding between them now, a shift that neither of them had expected. Jasmine had continued her duties with the same level of care and dedication, but now, there was something more. She wasn't just a maid, and he wasn't just the Mafia boss. The lines between them had blurred, and Jasmine wasn't sure where this new dynamic would lead. She tried to push aside the growing feelings inside her, focusing on Benji's recovery, but Dominic's presence lingered in the background, always there in subtle ways. He was still the authoritative figure, still the man who ran the household with an iron fist, but the moments between them, those quiet exchanges, were starting to mean more. It had been a week since Benji's fever had broken, and the boy was back to his playful self, running around the house with the same energy Jasmine had seen when she first arrived. Dominic, who had been spending more time with Benji, seemed to finally be able to relax. He even started reading books with him in the evenings, something Jasmine had never thought possible. One evening, after dinner, Dominic approached Jasmine as she was cleaning the dishes in the kitchen. She hadn't expected him to approach her so casually. His footsteps were soft, and when she turned, she was surprised to see him standing there, a slight smile on his face. "I was wondering if you'd join us for dinner tomorrow," he said, his voice quiet but inviting. Jasmine felt her heart skip a beat. "Join you?" she asked, unsure if she heard him correctly. "Yes," he replied. "You've been here long enough, and I wanted to thank you properly. I'm hosting a small dinner tomorrow, and I'd like you to be there." Jasmine stared at him, unsure how to respond. She wasn't used to this side of Dominic. She had never imagined he would invite her to join him, to be part of something outside of her role as his employee. She had always seen herself as an outsider in this world, but here was Dominic, asking her to be part of his evening. She felt a rush of emotions, surprise, hesitation, and something else she couldn't quite place. I don't know if that's appropriate, sir," Jasmine said, her voice unsure. Dominic's smile softened, and for the first time, there was no hint of authority in his eyes. "It's Dominic," he said gently. "And it's just dinner, Jasmine. You've done so much for Benji and for me. I think you deserve to enjoy a meal with us." Jasmine looked down at her hands, still holding the dishcloth. She felt the weight of his words settle in her chest, a warmth that she couldn't ignore. She had always kept her distance, always followed the unspoken rules of their relationship, but this felt different. It felt like he was seeing her, not just as an employee, but as someone worthy of being treated with respect. She could feel the walls she had built around herself beginning to crumble. She had never been invited to a dinner like this, never been part of the Castellano family's world in such a personal way. It was tempting, but Jasmine wasn't sure if she was ready to cross that line. But as she looked at Dominic, standing there in front of her, his eyes open and sincere, she realized that maybe it was time to stop holding back. "I'd like that," she said, her voice steady now. Dominic's expression brightened, and a small, genuine smile spread across his face. "Good," he said, before turning to leave. "I'll have everything prepared. I'll see you tomorrow." Jasmine watched him leave, the sound of his footsteps fading as he walked down the hallway. She stood there for a moment, processing what had just happened. She had agreed to go to dinner with Dominic, something she never thought she would do. It wasn't just a simple invitation. It was an acknowledgement, a gesture that showed he valued her beyond just her role in his household. The next evening, Jasmine prepared for the dinner, unsure of what to expect. She dressed in a simple, but elegant dress, something that made her feel both comfortable and presentable. As she entered the dining room, she was greeted with a warm atmosphere. The table was set beautifully, the soft glow of candles flickering in the dim light. Benji was already seated, happily chatting with Dominic, who was seated at the head of the table. The scene felt so normal, so familial, that Jasmine almost couldn't believe it. This wasn't the cold, intimidating world she had always known. This was something else entirely. "Jasmine, come join us," Dominic called as he saw her standing at the door. His voice was warm, inviting, and for the first time, Jasmine felt like she truly belonged in this space. She walked over to the table, her heart racing as she sat down beside Benji. For the next few hours, they ate, laughed, and shared stories. It was a simple evening, but it was one that Jasmine would never forget. She wasn't just a maid at that table. She was a guest, treated with respect and kindness. Dominic, too, seemed different. He was still the commanding presence, but there was a softness to him as he interacted with Benji and Jasmine. It was a side of him she had never seen before, and it made her see him in a new light. As the evening came to an end, Jasmine found herself reflecting on how far things had come. She had entered the Castellano household as an outsider, a quiet observer, but now, she was part of something bigger. She didn't know what the future held, but in that moment, she allowed herself to feel a sense of hope. Maybe, just maybe, things were finally changing. The days after the dinner felt like a dream to Jasmine. She had never imagined herself in such a position, sitting at the table with Dominic and Benji, sharing a meal in what seemed like a family setting. The evening had been simple, yet it had left her with a warmth in her chest that she couldn't ignore. As the days passed, Dominic seemed to soften more, and Jasmine couldn't help but notice the changes in him. He had always been a man of few words, a man who commanded respect with a glance. But now, there was something different about the way he looked at her, something she couldn't quite place. It wasn't just about the dinner. It was the small moments that followed. The way he would thank her for her help, the way he seemed more present when Benji was around, and even the quiet smiles they exchanged when they passed each other in the hallways. It was like the walls between them had slowly started to crumble, piece by piece. Jasmine tried not to think too much about it. She had learned long ago to keep her emotions in check, especially when it came to people like Dominic. He was still the Mafia boss, and she was still just a maid. She couldn't forget their roles, no matter how much things seemed to change. But there was a part of her, a small part that she tried to push down, that wondered what it would be like if things were different. What if she didn't have to hide behind her role as an employee? What if she could be more than just the woman who cleaned the house and took care of Benji? These thoughts made her uncomfortable, and she quickly dismissed them. She didn't belong in Dominic's world, no matter how much he seemed to see her as more than just a servant. One evening, as Jasmine was cleaning up after dinner, she noticed Dominic standing by the window, looking out over the grounds. It was a quiet evening, and Benji had already gone to bed. Jasmine had just finished her duties in the kitchen and was about to leave when Dominic's voice stopped her. "Jasmine," he called, turning slightly to face her. "Can you come here for a moment?" She hesitated, but then nodded and walked over to him, her heart pounding. She had no idea what he wanted, but the way he had asked her to come over felt different, more personal than anything they had shared before. "What is it?" she asked softly. Dominic paused for a moment, his gaze lingering on the darkened grounds outside before he looked at her. "I've been thinking," he began, his voice low. "You've been with us for a long time now, and I know I've never properly thanked you for everything you've done. But I want to change that." Jasmine's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't expected him to say that. She had always known that Dominic's gratitude, if it ever came, would be brief, perhaps even forced. But now, standing here in the quiet of the evening, his words seemed genuine. "You don't have to thank me," she replied quickly, not wanting to make things awkward. "I'm just doing my job." Dominic shook his head, taking a step closer to her. "No, Jasmine," he said, his voice firm but not unkind. "You've done more than your job. You've taken care of Benji. You've shown him kindness when I couldn't. I can't just ignore that." Jasmine was taken aback by his words. She had never heard him speak to her like this. It wasn't just gratitude. It was something deeper, something she hadn't expected from him. She began, but Dominic held up his hand. "I've been thinking about what you've done for my son, and I realize that I've been distant, detached from the people who matter most to me. But I want to change that. I want to be more present for Benji, and for you." His words were a surprise, a quiet admission that left Jasmine speechless. She had never expected Dominic to be so open, so vulnerable. It was as if the walls he had built around himself were beginning to come down. "I know I've never been easy to work with," he continued, his voice softer now. "But I want you to know that I appreciate everything you've done. You've become a part of this family, and I don't take that lightly." Jasmine didn't know how to respond. She had never been a part of any family in the way Dominic was talking about. She had always been an outsider, someone who worked in the background, invisible to those around her. But now, for the first time, it felt like Dominic was seeing her, truly seeing her, for who she was beyond her role as a maid. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm just glad I could help." Dominic smiled, the expression more genuine than she had ever seen. "You've done more than help," he said quietly. "You've made a difference in Benji's life. And in mine." Jasmine felt her heart swell at his words, but she quickly pushed the feeling down. This was Dominic Castellano, the man who controlled everything in his life with an iron grip. She couldn't forget that, no matter how soft he seemed now. "I'm glad I could be here for him," she said, her voice steady. Dominic looked at her for a long moment, as if trying to decide whether to say more. Finally, he spoke again. "You don't have to stay in the background anymore," he said quietly. "You've earned the right to be seen, Jasmine." His words hit her like a wave, washing over her and leaving her momentarily breathless. For a moment, she didn't know how to respond. She had always been in the background, always been the one who stayed out of the spotlight. But Dominic's words, the way he looked at her, made her feel like she finally had a place in this world, a place beyond her role as just a servant. She wasn't sure where this new path would lead, but for the first time, she allowed herself to believe that it might lead somewhere worth going. The days following Dominic's quiet declaration continued to shift the atmosphere within the Castellano household. Jasmine had always kept her distance, never allowing herself to grow too attached or comfortable in her role. But as time passed, there was a subtle change in her feelings toward Dominic, and more notably, in the way he treated her. It was a gradual transformation, one that she couldn't quite place, but it was undeniable. Dominic had become more present, more considerate. Gone were the days when he only acknowledged her presence with a curt nod or a fleeting glance. Now, there were moments when their eyes met across the room, and there was a shared understanding between them, something deeper than words. He had begun asking her about Benji's progress, about how she was feeling, not just as a maid, but as a person. It was small, yet it was enough to make her question everything she thought she knew about him. She had spent so long seeing him as the stoic Mafia boss, the man who ruled with authority and fear, but now there were cracks in that facade. Jasmine tried to ignore the flutter of confusion in her chest, the way her heart would race whenever Dominic spoke to her with such care. She reminded herself that she was still just his employee, still just the woman who cleaned his house and took care of his son. Yet, something in her longed for more, and it both frightened and intrigued her. One afternoon, as Jasmine was tending to Benji in the garden, she noticed Dominic standing at the edge of the yard, watching them quietly. His usual cold demeanor was softened by the gentle smile on his face as he watched Benji chase butterflies. It was a rare sight. Dominic, the powerful Mafia boss, relaxed and content. He was still a man of few words, but in moments like these, Jasmine saw a different side of him, one that was warm and full of care. She stood up, brushing the dirt from her hands, and walked over to him. He turned as she approached, his gaze meeting hers, and for a moment, There was a stillness between them, as if time had slowed. "He's getting better," Jasmine said, glancing over at Benji, who was now sitting on the grass, tired but happy. Dominic nodded, his eyes following his son's every move. "He is," he replied softly. "You've done a good job, Jasmine. I don't know what I would have done without you." Jasmine was taken aback by the sincerity in his voice. She had heard him thank her before, but this felt different. It wasn't just the obligatory gratitude he usually gave. It was something deeper, something that made her feel as though he truly saw her for the first time. She looked away, suddenly unsure of what to say. "I'm just doing my best," she replied, her voice steady despite the fluttering in her chest. Dominic took a step closer to her, and for the first time, there was no space between them. The air around them seemed to thrum with an unspoken tension, and Jasmine's breath caught in her throat. "You've done more than your best," Dominic said, his voice soft but firm. "You've done something that no one else could do. Benji trusts you, and I trust you." Jasmine's heart skipped a beat at his words. She had never expected him to say something like that, especially not with such genuine emotion. For a moment, she stood there, not knowing how to respond. She had always thought of herself as an outsider in this world, just a maid, just a servant. But here was Dominic, the man who held so much power, speaking to her as though she mattered, as though she was more than just the person who cleaned his house. "Thank you," she said quietly, looking down at her hands. "That means a lot to me." Dominic's gaze softened, and he placed a hand gently on her shoulder. It was a simple gesture, but to Jasmine, it felt like a promise, an unspoken acknowledgement of everything she had done, of everything she had sacrificed. "You don't need to thank me," he said, his voice low. "I should be the one thanking you." The words hung in the air, and Jasmine felt something stir inside her, a mix of gratitude and something more, something she couldn't quite name. The moment stretched on, and for the first time, Jasmine felt herself truly seen. She wasn't just a maid anymore. She wasn't just someone who was here to take care of Benji. She was someone who mattered to Dominic, in ways she had never imagined. As the days passed, Jasmine found herself slipping into this new reality, one where Dominic was more than just the powerful Mafia boss. He was still a man of strength and control, but he was also someone who cared deeply for his son, someone who was beginning to let his guard down around her. And as much as she tried to convince herself that this was just a fleeting moment, something inside her told her that it wasn't. She had begun to see a different side of Dominic, and she couldn't deny that she was beginning to care for him in ways she hadn't expected. One evening, as Jasmine was preparing to leave for the night, she found Dominic waiting for her in the hallway. He was standing by the stairs, his arms crossed over his chest, but there was something in his posture that made him seem less like the Mafia boss and more like a man who was unsure of what to say. "Jasmine," he said quietly as she approached, his voice steady but not without hesitation. "I've been thinking." Jasmine stopped in her tracks, looking at him with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. She had no idea where this conversation would lead, but something told her that it was going to change everything. "I wanted to ask you something," Dominic continued, his eyes meeting hers. "I don't know where this is going, but would you like to stay here? With us?" Jasmine blinked, unsure if she had heard him correctly. "Stay here?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Dominic nodded. "Yes. I know it's sudden, but you've been here for so long, and I don't want you to leave." Jasmine's heart raced as the weight of his words settled in. She had never imagined that Dominic would ask her to stay, to become a part of his world in this way. For so long, she had kept herself at a distance, never daring to dream of being more than just a servant in his eyes. But now, with his words hanging in the air, she realized that maybe things had changed. Maybe she wasn't just a maid anymore. And maybe, just maybe, she had a place in this world after all. The days that followed Dominic's invitation to stay were filled with uncertainty for Jasmine. She had never imagined herself in a position like this, caught between the life she had built for herself and the world that Dominic represented. The invitation itself had been a surprise, and as the days passed, Jasmine found herself reflecting on it more than she had intended. Could she truly stay? Could she accept what Dominic was offering without losing herself in the process? She had always kept her distance from him, from the Castellano family, knowing full well that her place was not among them. She was the help, the maid, the one who cleaned and cared for Benji. But now, The lines between them had started to blur, and it was hard for her to ignore the pull she felt toward him. It wasn't just about the way he had treated her recently. It was the way he had spoken to her, the way he had seen her for who she was beyond her role in his home. For the first time, she felt like she mattered to him, like she wasn't just someone he employed, but someone who had earned his respect. As she walked through the mansion, preparing for another long day, Jasmine couldn't help but notice the change in the air. There was a subtle shift in the way the staff treated her, the way the house seemed to pulse with a quieter energy. It was as if everyone knew that something was different, though no one spoke of it aloud. Dominic, too, seemed to have become more present. He wasn't as distant as he had once been, always too busy with business to truly engage with those around him. But now he took more time to ask about Benji, about her, about the things that mattered to him. He was no longer just the commanding Mafia boss. He was the father who had learned to care, to open up, even if only in small ways. The evening of the dinner, when Dominic had first made his request for her to stay, replayed in Jasmine's mind. The simplicity of the gesture, the honesty in his voice, it had caught her off guard. She wasn't sure what it meant, but she knew that it was a turning point. She couldn't just walk away from this, from the connection that was beginning to form between them. As the days passed, Jasmine found herself spending more time with Benji, as she always had, but with a growing awareness of Dominic's presence. He would come into the room, his gaze always landing on her first, before shifting to Benji. It was as though he was learning to let his guard down around her, and Jasmine couldn't help but feel the weight of his attention. One evening, after dinner, Dominic found her once again in the kitchen, cleaning up. He seemed to be searching for something to say, his usual confidence replaced with a more tentative air. "Jasmine," he began, his voice softer than usual. "I've been thinking." Jasmine paused, glancing up at him. "About what?" she asked, her heart beginning to race. "About what you said the other night," he replied, stepping closer to her. "About staying." He looked down at the floor for a moment, as if gathering his thoughts. "I meant it. I don't want you to feel like you don't have a place here. I've seen what you've done for Benji. I can't ignore that." Jasmine's breath caught in her throat at his words. She hadn't expected him to bring it up again so soon, but hearing him say it made something stir inside her. "I don't want to overstep," she said quietly, unsure of how to proceed. "You've already done more than I could ever ask," Dominic said, his voice steady. "You've been here when no one else has. And I don't want you to feel like you're just a maid in this house. You've earned more than that. You've earned the right to be part of this family, if that's what you want." Jasmine felt a lump form in her throat at his words. She had never imagined herself in this position, in this house, being offered a place in a world she had always kept herself at arm's length from. She was a maid, not part of their world, but the invitation, the recognition, it was everything she had ever wanted, yet never dared to dream. I don't know what to say," she said softly, her voice wavering. "You don't have to say anything," Dominic replied gently. "Just know that you have a place here, if you want it. You're not just a servant, Jasmine. You're someone who's earned my respect, and that means something to me." His words settled in her chest like a weight, heavy and unfamiliar. Jasmine had always been careful, always been aware of the boundaries between herself and Dominic, but now the lines were less defined, and it left her feeling uncertain. Could she really accept this change? Could she allow herself to become part of a world that she had always viewed from the outside? She wasn't sure. But as she looked at Dominic, standing there in front of her, there was a part of her that longed to say yes, to accept his offer and step into a new life. "I need some time to think," she said quietly, her voice steadying. "Of course," Dominic replied, his expression softening. "Take all the time you need, but know that the offer is always there." With that, he turned and left the room, leaving Jasmine standing there, alone with her thoughts. As she stood in the quiet kitchen, the weight of his words hung in the air. She wasn't sure what the future held, but she knew that this moment, this crossroads, was one she would never forget. For the first time in her life, she wasn't just invisible. She mattered, and that realization changed everything. The days that followed Dominic's invitation to stay were filled with questions, each one clouding Jasmine's thoughts more than the last. She had always kept herself distanced, knowing her place within the walls of the Castellano mansion. She had been the help, the maid who worked tirelessly for Benji's well-being, always under the radar, always out of sight. But now, with Dominic's offer lingering in her mind. The lines between what was expected of her and what she wanted blurred more than ever before. She hadn't imagined that the powerful mafia boss who ran everything in his world would care so deeply about her, or her role in his life. It was as though everything she thought she knew had been turned upside down. She walked through the hallways of the mansion, moving like a shadow, wondering whether she was still the person she had always been. Dominic, too, seemed different. She could see it in the way he interacted with Benji, the way he watched him grow stronger, more lively with each passing day. The walls he had once built around himself, the cold distance that had defined him for so long, were slowly crumbling. He wasn't just the ruthless mafia boss anymore. He was a father, one who genuinely wanted the best for his son. And now, as she spent more time around him, Jasmine realized that Dominic didn't want to be just a figurehead in Benji's life. He wanted to be a real father, to make up for lost time. One evening, Dominic approached her in the garden, where she was sitting on the bench, enjoying the quiet of the dusk. Benji had already gone to bed, and the house was unusually still. The moment Dominic appeared at the edge of the garden, Jasmine's heart skipped a beat. He had been quieter these past few days, more thoughtful, as if something weighed on him that he couldn't quite shake. "Jasmine," he said softly, his voice carrying in the evening air. She looked up, surprised to see him. "You've been quiet lately," she remarked, sensing the unease in his demeanor. Dominic sat beside her, his presence larger than life, yet his mood was subdued. "I've been thinking a lot," he began, his tone contemplative. "About Benji, about everything." Jasmine remained silent, waiting for him to continue. She had always been a good listener, especially with him. He had never opened up to her like this before, but she could tell that something had changed inside him. "I'm trying to be the father he needs," Dominic said quietly, staring out at the horizon. "But I've spent so many years focused on the wrong things. I thought power, control, and fear were what mattered most, but now I see that I've neglected the one thing that truly matters: love." Jasmine felt her chest tighten at his words. She had seen the walls he had built around himself, the way he had isolated himself from everyone, even his own son. She had never imagined that someone like Dominic, so driven by power and control, would come to realize the importance of love and connection. It was a rare moment of vulnerability, one that struck her deeply. "You're not alone in this," she said softly, her voice reassuring. "Benji needs you, yes, but he also needs your love, your presence. And you've already started giving that to him." Dominic turned to her, his eyes searching hers, as if looking for something he couldn't quite put into words. For a moment, their gazes met, and Jasmine felt a quiet understanding pass between them. It was as though they had both been through something together, something that had brought them closer than they had ever been before. "I don't know if I deserve it," Dominic said after a long pause. His voice was barely above a whisper, full of self-doubt. Jasmine shook her head. "No one is perfect," she replied gently. "But you're trying, and that's what matters." Dominic let out a soft sigh, leaning back against the bench, his gaze once again turning to the horizon. "I never thought I'd be here," he said. "In this place, with all these emotions I've been running from for so long. It's hard, Jasmine. Harder than I thought." Jasmine could feel the weight of his words, the heaviness in his voice. She didn't know what it was like to carry the burdens he did, to be a man who had built his empire on fear and control. But she did know what it was like to carry the weight of her own choices, her own regrets. And in that moment, she felt a deep connection with him, one that transcended their roles in each other's lives. They were both trying to find their way in a world that had been unforgiving, a world where love and vulnerability often took a back seat to power. "You're not alone," Jasmine said again, this time with more conviction. "You have Benji. You have me." Dominic turned to her then, his gaze intense. It wasn't a look of command or authority, but something softer, more real. He seemed to consider her words for a long time before finally speaking. "I don't know what I've done to deserve someone like you," he said, his voice low. "But I'm grateful. Grateful in ways I can't express." Jasmine's heart fluttered at his words. She had never expected him to say something like that, let alone to feel this way about her. "You don't have to thank me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm just here. I'm just doing what I can." Dominic smiled softly, and for the first time, it wasn't the smile of a man in control. It was the smile of someone who had finally found a piece of peace, a piece of himself that had been missing for so long. I don't know what the future holds, he said quietly, but for the first time, I feel like I'm on the right path. And I want you to be a part of it, Jasmine, if you're willing. Jasmine's heart skipped a beat at his words, but for once, she didn't feel the need to retreat, to hide behind her role. She had never imagined this kind of connection, this understanding. But now, as she sat beside Dominic, she realized that maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something new, something worth exploring. And for the first time, she allowed herself to believe that she could have a place in this world, in his world, and that it was a place she deserved. The days passed with a quiet rhythm that Jasmine had come to appreciate. The tension that once filled the mansion seemed to dissipate, replaced by a sense of calm that hung in the air like the soft scent of jasmine flowers blooming outside the window. She had never expected things to change so drastically, not just with Dominic, but with herself as well. She was no longer just a maid in the Castellano house. She was someone who mattered, someone who had earned the respect of the man who ruled this world. Dominic's presence had become a constant, but not in the way it once had been. He no longer dominated every space he entered with a sharp, intimidating gaze. Instead, he was more relaxed, more engaged, especially when it came to Benji. Jasmine had witnessed this change firsthand. She had seen how he began to put more effort into spending time with his son, making sure Benji's recovery continued on track, and even bringing him small gifts, things she never thought Dominic would consider. It was a stark contrast to the man he had once been, the man who had always seemed emotionally distant, caught up in the cold mechanics of running a criminal empire. And now, every time their eyes met, Jasmine felt the unspoken understanding between them grow. It wasn't just about the work she did, or the way she cared for Benji. It was about something more, something deeper. Dominic had started treating her differently too, in small but meaningful ways. He would ask about her day, about her well-being, and for the first time, he genuinely seemed interested in her thoughts. One evening, after dinner, as Jasmine was finishing up in the kitchen, she felt a familiar presence behind her. She turned, surprised to see Dominic standing there, his posture relaxed, a rare sight for the usually imposing figure he cut. His expression was soft, almost contemplative, and for the first time, he didn't seem like the man who had everything under control. "Jasmine," he said, his voice lower than usual. She set down the dish she had been drying and turned to face him. "Yes?" she asked, her heart quickening just slightly at the way he was looking at her. "I've been thinking," he began, his eyes searching hers as if weighing his words carefully, "about everything that's happened between us." Jasmine's breath caught in her throat. She wasn't sure what he was going to say, but she could feel her own walls starting to rise, the guard she had kept around her emotions beginning to take form once more. "I never thought I would be here," he continued, his voice steady but filled with an honesty she had not expected. "In this place, with Benji, with you." Jasmine remained silent, not wanting to interrupt, but every word he spoke felt like it was unraveling something inside her. She had always kept her distance, never letting herself imagine a different kind of life. But now, with Dominic opening up in a way she never thought possible, everything she had believed seemed to shift. "I know it's been difficult," he said, his voice low. "I've never been good at showing how I feel, but I realize now that I need to. Not just for Benji, but for you too." The words hung between them like a delicate thread. Jasmine could hardly believe what she was hearing. Dominic Castellano, the man who had always been a fortress of coldness and command, was speaking to her as if she mattered, as if she was more than just the maid. "You've shown me a different side of things," he continued. "I never realized how much I've been missing, not just in terms of Benji, but in how I've been treating people, including you. And I want to make it right." Jasmine's heart fluttered in her chest, but she didn't know how to respond. This wasn't the man she had known. It wasn't the man who had treated her like an invisible figure in his world. "Dominic," she said softly, her voice trembling slightly. "You don't have to apologize. You've already done more than enough." Dominic took a step closer to her, his eyes never leaving hers. "No," he said firmly. "I'm not apologizing. I'm acknowledging something. You've done more for me, for Benji, than I ever imagined anyone could. And I don't want you to feel like you're just an outsider anymore." His words struck her deeply, more deeply than she expected. She had spent so much of her life keeping her distance, protecting herself from becoming too attached, too involved in a world that wasn't hers. But now, standing here with Dominic, she realized that she didn't have to live in the shadows anymore. He had seen her, truly seen her. For the first time, she felt like she mattered to someone, not because of what she did, but because of who she was. "I don't know what to say," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. Dominic smiled softly, the expression gentle and filled with warmth. "You don't have to say anything," he replied. "I just want you to know that you have a place here. You always have." The sincerity in his words wrapped around her like a comforting blanket. It was something she had never expected, and yet here it was, laid out before her. A place in his world. A place beside him. It was too much to fully process in the moment, but as she looked at him, she knew that everything was changing. She wasn't just a maid anymore. She wasn't just a caretaker. She was part of something, part of a world that she had never dared to imagine. And in that moment, standing in the kitchen, Jasmine allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she had found the place she was always meant to be. The days that followed Dominic's revelation continued to feel surreal for Jasmine. The invitation to stay in his world, the recognition of her worth, it had all felt like a dream. But with each passing day, the reality of it began to settle in, and Jasmine found herself trying to navigate this new chapter with a quiet sense of awe. She had never expected to be here, in the heart of the Castellano world, accepted in ways she hadn't thought possible. For years, she had kept herself at a distance, living in the background, keeping her emotions in check, never allowing herself to hope for anything beyond the walls of the mansion. Yet now, things were changing. Dominic's treatment of her had shifted, no longer the cold indifference she had grown used to, but something warmer, more genuine. She could see it in the way he interacted with her, the way his gaze softened when he spoke to her, the way he seemed to trust her more with each passing day. She wasn't just the maid anymore. She was someone who had earned a place beside him, beside Benji. One evening, as the sun began to set, Jasmine found herself in the garden, tending to the flowers. It had become a routine, something that helped clear her mind after a long day of work. She was lost in the quiet simplicity of the task when she heard footsteps approaching. She turned to see Dominic walking toward her, a slight smile on his face. It was rare to see him so relaxed, but tonight there was a different energy in the air, one that seemed to shift the space between them. "You look peaceful," Dominic said, his voice low but warm. Jasmine smiled softly. "Just trying to enjoy the quiet," she replied, brushing a few strands of hair from her face. He stopped a few feet away from her, his hands casually tucked in his pockets. "I wanted to talk to you," he said, his expression more serious now. Jasmine's heart skipped a beat. She had no idea what he was going to say, but the way he looked at her made her feel as though whatever was coming would be important. "What's on your mind?" she asked, her voice soft. Dominic hesitated for a moment before speaking. "I've been thinking a lot lately," he began, his gaze shifting to the horizon. "About everything. About Benji, about my life, about us." Jasmine's breath caught in her throat. "US?" she repeated, unsure if she had heard him correctly. Dominic looked back at her, his eyes locking with hers. "Yes," he said quietly. "I know we've been through a lot, and I've been trying to figure out where I fit in all of this. I've spent my whole life chasing power, chasing control, but when it comes to you and Benji, I realize I don't need that. I just need to be here." Jasmine felt a wave of emotion wash over her. She hadn't expected him to say anything like this. The man who had always been so controlled, so distant, was now standing before her, admitting his vulnerabilities. "You've already done more than enough," Jasmine said, her voice barely above a whisper. "No," Dominic replied, his tone firm. "I haven't. I've spent so much of my life focused on things that didn't matter, pushing people away, thinking I could do everything on my own. But now I see the value in having people by my side, people who care. And you, Jasmine, you've been there for Benji and me in ways that I can't even explain." His words struck her deeply, more deeply than she expected. For the first time, she felt like she wasn't just an employee to him, but someone who had truly made a difference in his life. She had always seen him as the leader, the one who called the shots, but now, in this moment, she saw a different side of him. A side that was raw and real, one that needed the support of those around him. "I never thought this would happen," Dominic continued, taking a step closer. "I never thought I'd allow myself to feel this way, to trust someone like this. But with you, I don't feel like I'm losing control. I feel like I'm gaining something important. Jasmine didn't know how to respond. She had spent so many years keeping herself distant, never allowing herself to believe that something like this could happen. But now, standing here with Dominic, she realized that maybe she had been wrong all along. Maybe she could allow herself to be part of something more, something bigger than just the role she had always played. I'm here for you, she said softly, her voice steady. And I'm here for Benji. You don't have to do this alone. Dominic's expression softened, and for a moment, he just looked at her, as if weighing her words. Then, slowly he nodded. Thank you, he said quietly. I think I've finally found what I've been looking for. Jasmine felt a warmth spread through her chest at his words. It was as though, in this one moment, everything had fallen into place. The walls that had once separated them were now gone, replaced by an understanding that transcended their roles. Dominic reached out, his hand gently touching hers. The simple gesture, the unspoken connection, spoke volumes. They didn't need to say anything more. Jasmine felt a shift inside her, one that she couldn't fully explain, but it was a feeling she couldn't deny. She wasn't just a maid anymore. She wasn't just a caretaker. She was someone who had earned a place beside Dominic, beside Benji. And for the first time in her life, she felt like she truly belonged. The quiet of the evening wrapped around them like a blanket, and Jasmine knew that whatever the future held, she was ready to face it. With Dominic, with Benji, and with a sense of belonging she had never known before.